us this evening. For those who don't know, this is hosted by United Learning, and this is run as part of our EdTech Demonstrator programme. So what this means is that we're able to offer support to schools across the country and run webinars using our experts such as Joe, who's joining us. He's Deputy Head at Avonwood. So he's going to be joining us today and leading this session for you. Whilst we're in the session, please do feel free to ask any questions in the chat box. Dan and I are both here to help as well. And as Dan said, we are recording it. We will be sharing out the information for you. And we do hope that you find it really useful today. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Joe. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Joe.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gemma. Welcome, everyone. Really looking forward to today. And let's address the elephant in the room first of all, which is, of course, as Dan has mentioned a few minutes ago, the announcement for the full reopening on the 8th of March puts this in a slightly different perspective. However, a lot of the reports that have come out, the Ofsted report, among others, have highlighted that good teaching is good teaching. And visualizers, when used well, are a component of good teaching. So the agenda for today looks something like this, approximately 5 minutes on each, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more. First of all, we'll talk about why a visualer might be useful in the classroom, for both in a remote sense and in a bricks and mortar sense. And then I'll go through some examples that I've thought about from my own practice and speaking to other teachers across our school and more widely. So I've got 3 maths examples, one for probably about a year 2 level around visualizing division. Then there's something more for upper key stage 2, year 6 specifically for representing ratio. Then something around time, which I think is really important to consider and has implications for all our secondary colleagues too. Then the last 3 examples are more literacy based, handwriting, live marking, although I'll actually have a look at a piece of science work for that, and reading engagement. Then I'll just finish off by a few top tips that I thought of, and that will comprise today's sessions, leaving a bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So I hope that makes sense, and let's make a start. First of all, why use a visualizer at all? So let's make this a bit of an active session too, and let me throw that out to the chat, to all of you. Fastest fingers first. Give us an example of when you have used a visualizer in the classroom, either remotely or in a bricks and mortar classroom. So if you can go to the chat now and contribute by letting us know how you've used a visualizer, why you've used a visualizer.
Well, we've got some great bits coming through. We've got modelling and art. We've got modelling concepts. Showing methods in maths.
Becky, that was super fast for the modelling and art. Thanks very much for that one. Also, Caroline and R. Thomas, really quick off the mark there. Yes, Julie, using manipulatives in maths. That's one thing that we'll have a look at. Demonstrating dissection. Wow. Yeah, one of the things I think in terms of demonstrations, obviously that has remote implications, but when you're live in the classroom and you might want to do some sort of demonstration, perhaps that's difficult to show to everyone. You may not have enough resources, or maybe on quite a small scale. So demonstrating a dissection and using Visualizer to share that with everyone can be really powerful. Yeah, reading and modeling annotations as you go through. I think for under demonstrations or indeed as we're going into guided practice, I absolutely agree, Julie, how to use a pair of compasses or a protractor. That a visualizer is so useful. I found so often in my time in a maths classroom that you'll show, you might show a big example on the whiteboard at the front, and then I seem to be repeating the same thing again and again to individual children. So in terms of guided practice and showing that under a visualizer, one of the things that a kind of large scale protractor tends to have only one set of increments, whereas of course a lot of the protractors that you give to children have 2 sets of increments, and working out which increment scale to use can be really tricky. So some of the other ideas that I've thought about are scaffolding. So if we've got a kind of mastery approach to the curriculum and we want to bring the majority of children through the curriculum at largely the same pace, then the use of scaffolding or the use of Visualiser as a scaffolding method can be very, very powerful. The use of Visualisers for live feedback is again incredibly important. It allows you to pick up on misconceptions. It allows you to provide that interception of a misconception, share that with others, so perhaps then they don't make that same mistake, and of course move the class on as well as the individual at the same time. I also think Visualisers are great for promoting metacognitive talk, because it allows you to narrate your own thinking, your own decision processes as you work your way through a problem, and that's something that has been proven by research to have a big impact on student attainment. You can also use it for those fundamental things like presentation expectations. Actually, this is what we expect your work to look like. This is what a good example of work should look like, and showing a student's piece of work is, I think, perhaps more powerful than showing a pre-prepared example, although there is a place for pre-prepared examples too. I think the other thing that springs to mind for me personally is I was lucky enough to go out with the DFE a few years ago to Shanghai, and one of the notable aspects in every Shanghai classroom as a high-performing jurisdiction was the use of Visualisers in every single lesson that I went into. They had a very set way of using the Visualiser, so that would be a way of securing that high success rate before moving on to the next part of the lesson. They would also have a very specific and codified way of using color coding to for example, errors would be marked out in one color, things that we've done well in another color, and I thought that was a really powerful and sensible way of approaching a live marking. So a real hallmark of Shanghai pedagogy. Gemma, I think you mentioned as well that you'd seen that used a lot in South Korea too.
Yeah, so when I was living in Asia, I had a lot of Korean friends. We actually had a Korean department in our school, and again, they were very keen to continue with use of a Visualiser. Again, in almost like a very slightly different way to how we would be using it, and I used to use it in my classroom practice back here. It has become a bit of a tool that really does have a whole array of different benefits of using it.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. And so I think just to go back to framing of today's session, it's about good teaching practice, Visualisers being a component, one of those tools in the repertoire of teaching that we have, and that's as applicable for our bricks and mortar teaching as it is for remote teaching as well. One of the top tips that I'll come to later, of course, is the not overusing it, and particularly for remote learning. So I've just put a link to Tim Dolan's YouTube video on the uses. I think he outlines 20 possible uses of Visualisers. Pretty good, worth watching. He's got a couple of different videos on Visualisers. So something that I use as a resource in preparing for this, and worthwhile. So a bit of shout out to Tim there. So first example, and yes, thanks, Julie, sharing examples of answers and discussing good practice. Absolutely. The first example that I want to have a look at, and this was in a key stage one, probably year two sort of mind frame that I thought of it, was around visualizing division. And I think it's one thing with my maths hat on. So I'm that's the area of the curriculum that I'm passionate in. I'm primary based, but I'm a teacher for master's specialist. When I went out to Shanghai, it's for the mathematics teacher exchange program. And one of the things that we often don't get quite right, I believe, is the conceptual understanding of what division means, particularly when it comes to two different models of division. The EEF guidance, Education Endowment Fund, and the Teaching for Mastery principles espoused by the Maths Hubs and the NCETM all point towards the value of using manipulatives in order to secure conceptual understanding. Moreover, I don't know if any of you have read this book. I've got it to hand as it happens. Why Students Don't Like School, written by a cognitive scientist called Daniel T. Willingham. Highly recommended if you had a chance to read it. But he also talks about how it's our job as educators to help children make sense of what it is they're presented with. So the material his famous quote is, memory is the residue of thought. So the material is one thing, but what students think about in terms of the material that's presented to them is just as important. So if we can help them to make sense of what it is that they're seeing, then they're much more likely to retain that information, that understanding in the long term. He also talks about the use of scaffolds in order to reduce cognitive load. The two models I referred to just a moment ago in terms of division is the sharing model versus the grouping model. And of course, when we think of particularly as you get into secondary education and you're generally more reliant on these algorithm skills, the procedural skills being in place and secure at from their primary education, actually what is often the case is that children who are just about holding on, they tend to understand division, in my experience, very much in the sense of sharing, because in many real world examples that's what we come across. But all the formal algorithms, or the algorithms when we think of short or long division, are based on the grouping conception of division. And so therefore it's important to be able to explore both of those and make them explicit. And I'm just going to use a really simple example to have a look at this, which is 10 divided by 2 equals 5. So I'm just going to switch to my visualizer now. Fingers crossed. So Gemma, are you okay to see my visualizer?
Yep, it's looking good, thank you.
Perfect. So as you can see, what I've set up here is a bar model populated or inhabited by these these multi-link cubes here. Of course, you could be using Unifix as well, and we can see that in its initial placement, I've said, okay, well look, the whole here is 10, and I've got those 10 cubes here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 cubes here to represent what we mean by the whole. And then if we're saying that we're going to do 10 divided by 2, well, what does that look like? Well, class, of course, if we're doing 10 divided by 2, then what we're saying here is as we divide it into 2, we're dividing it into 2 equal parts. So we want to partition it somewhere about there. Apologies if that's not quite accurate, but that gives us about 2 equal parts. One of the things that I'd always try and do, Gemma, is that coming up live? Can you see the line that I've drawn?
No, I can't see the line at the moment.
Just bear with me a second. I'm just going to relaunch my visualizer, and this is one of the things, one of the technical things when you're doing remote learning, of course, that you need to be aware of. I've found that when you're launching the visualizer, I always try and have it open beforehand, but sometimes then you need to relaunch it in order to make sure that it is showing a live picture. Yeah, there we go. So we've got these 10 cubes here, of course, and 10's our whole, and then we've got those 2 equal parts. 10 divided by 2 equals something. One of the things that I'd always try and make sure that I'm doing is making deliberate mistakes, of course, as we're going on. So say, oh, okay, so year 2, here we go. So we've done 10 divided by 2. We've made 2 equal parts. Do you agree, Amy? And then hopefully we get a chorus of no, that's not right. They're not equal parts. Oh, they're not equal parts. How is that the case? How do you know that? Oh, because you can see less on this side. There's only 4 on this side, and there's more on this side. Oh, of course, you're right. That's not 2 equal parts. So it must look like this then. And I might go on, of course, still making a deliberate mistake. But at some point, then, of course, we're going to arrive at the conclusion that 10 split into 2 equal parts produces the quotient of 5. And I would underpin that use of manipulatives on the visualizer by completing that equation, that number sentence at the same time. Now, what that allows us to do is explore that sharing model in this instance that we've partitioned 10 into 2 equal parts. But over time, what we also want to make sure that we're doing is that I heard it referred to by a colleague once as the Gazinta model. Well, that means then, what she meant by that is by the time we get to using formal algorithms, we might mean that 10 divided by 2, we're saying, well, how many times does 2 go into, how many times does it go into 10? Well, it goes in 5 times, but actually we're talking about a slightly different model then. We're talking about 5 groups of 2, and that's not what we're shown here. And so it allows us to explore that with the visual backup. And of course, that's where you'd look at perhaps this idea on a number line, and rather than using the the part or puppet hole model or the bar model that I've set up here, you might begin to show it in a slightly different way. You might begin to show it in multiples of 2 on a number line. So that's the first example that I want to have a look at. That sharing versus grouping, really simple example of 10 divided by 2 and showing how that might be used to furnish understanding for children. So let me just stop sharing our visualizer.
Oh, for fuck's sake, you dumbass.
And I'll just go back to my presentation. Thanks for bearing with me as the technology catches up. Okay, the second example that I want to think about is representing ratio. So representing ratio is something that I found when teaching Key Stage 2 produces all kinds of conceptual as well as procedural errors. And so therefore, it's really, really important to be able to use manipulatives to show what's going on when we're talking about a given ratio. Cuisenaire rods are also fantastically useful, although I always tend to say that we'll use multiple parts to show that it's multiplicative reasoning. Bar models are a natural progression from Cuisenaire rods, or indeed unifix, as I'm going to show in a moment. And this is really a visual representation of algebraic reasoning and can be used to kind of backtrack and do some backfilling work at the lower parts of Key Stage 3. So I think it's really important that you use these manipulatives alongside the pictorial, that you can use these manipulatives, as I'll show in a moment, to show how it refers to pattern iteration. And importantly, scaling and simplification of ratios can clearly be demonstrated. So I've got another pause point for you now. I'm going to show the pictorial image. There you can see it on the screen. And I've got 2 questions there for you. In the chat, can you let us know with just a 1 and a T and a 2 and a T if you think that is true or false? You can just write T or F for true or false. I'm just going to get my resources ready, so I'll leave you to that. If you can pop that into the chat for the meantime, that'd be great. I think in practical terms, that's what I always try and do, is to leave the class with something to do as I'm getting the resources ready, and of course try to have as many resources prepped and ready as we can. Because I'm reusing that same space to show several different things, I need to just adjust that space before I start sharing the visualizer again, of course. Dan says true, Gemma, true.
And you could also set up a poll on that, couldn't you?
Of course, yes, absolutely. Ellie, thanks. So you've gone for true and true. Interesting. So I'll just give you another 20 seconds or so. Thanks, Julie. 1, true, 2, true. You've gone for true for both. All right, thanks to those who have contributed to that. I'm just going to switch back to the visualizer now and talk through that particular example. Gemma, has that come up okay?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
And can you see my hands?
Yeah.
Which is now displayed. Perfect.
Yes,
all right, so we've got a live feed. Fantastic. So of course the image that we had, if I just show you the image that we had, looked like this, didn't it? It looked like that image there. And then we had that question of true or false. And one of the things that I realized when I did this with the Year 6 class is that because students, in this case you all attending today, because you're listening, you're concentrating on things, in terms of cognitive load, it's a bit difficult to remember the question whilst you then switch to a visualizer. So I would definitely say that make sure that there's still access, like I've done here, to the question whilst you do any modeling of how to work that out. So the first thing I've done is replicated the visual image by using physical manipulatives, by using those physical cubes there. And then we can have a look at that first one. For every one red cube, there are 4 blue cubes. Well, is that true? Well, as we think about pattern simplification, we can say, oh yes, well, if we then take one line away, we can see that 8 to 2 is in fact the same as 4 to 1, because it's about reiterating that pattern. The second question, in the year 6 class I did this with, everyone was pretty good for that first one. Now there was actually about 4 or 5 questions I did for the year 6 class, and the last question was phrased in this way: for every 20 cubes, so you got the total amount of cubes first, of course, with a bit of variation thrown in that sense. 16 are blue, 4 are red, true or false. And I had one quite high flying student absolutely adamant that that was false, actually. And I could only get to the bottom of it by reiterating this pattern by saying, well, Jasmine, it wasn't Jasmine, but I can't remember who the student was now. So Jasmine, do you agree that from our initial picture of 8 to 2, that we can simplify that? The simplest form of that ratio is 4 to 1, or 1 red cube to 4, 1 to 4 blue cubes. Yes, I agree. Brilliant. Thanks, Jasmine. So we can see that could be 2 to 8. That was the original image that we had. If we carry on iterating that pattern, well, how many cubes were there, Jasmine, in every line? Jasmine says, okay, there are 5 cubes in every line. So how many cubes do you have so far? Oh yes, I can see that we've got 10 cubes. Very good, Jasmine. Good. So if we iterate that pattern again, and I know I've used green here, but just to show the difference, now we've got 3 lines of that pattern. How many cubes do you have altogether? Oh, there are 15. There are 15 cubes, Mr. Jackson. Excellent, Jasmine. Well done. Okay, so how many more lines do you think we'd need to get 20 cubes? Because this is what we said for the second question, that there are 20 cubes. Oh, I need one more line. Oh, okay, well, let's do that, Jasmine. We've got one more line of cubes, and then we can see here we are. We've got a full set of those 20 cubes. Are you happy so far, Jasmine? Yes, I'm happy so far. Brilliant. Okay, now when you have a look at that, can you tell me how many red cubes there are? Oh, I can see 4 blue cubes. Can you see how many blue cubes there are? Brilliant. We get to a situation where there's a shared understanding constructed through the use of manipulatives underneath the visualizer to say that, yes, she does actually think that it is true. We agree that for every 20 cubes, 16 are blue. Yes, in this case, I've used some green ones, and 4 are red. So I'm just going to switch back to my slide a second. Thanks for being patient whilst we wait for the technology to catch up with us. Gemma, can you see my slides again? Have they come up?
Yeah, so it's just
fantastic.
Timing.
Great. So the third example was an example. My daughter is currently in year 2, and actually she was having a real problem with. She's generally all right with her maths. She's doing quite well, but she had a real problem with time. And I thought we'd spent some time learning about time, and that was secure for her. But this wasn't the case. And actually, when I started thinking about it, it's because of the multiple aspects, the multiple assaults on cognitive load that go on when we're talking about time. There's the representations, the different representations that we have for time, whether that's Roman numerals on a clock face, or different colours that come into play, or how it looks different on one watch compared to another watch, or the fact that if you pick up your iPhone, then you've got a 24-hour digital clock on there, which looks entirely different again. So all these different representations cause a bit of an issue. There's the language that goes alongside time, past and to, and what those prepositions actually refer to. There's the fact that you've got a double track number line in place. By that I mean there's a circular number line in place where you have both minutes and hours going along on that same number line, and one hand refers to one hand refers to the other. There's the fact that you have to be able to count in multiples of 5. For every 1 hour, there are 5 minutes, of course, in terms of those number line increments. And of course, then to compound all of that, you've got the concepts of fractions coming in there: quarter past, half past, quarter to. So there's a huge amount to unpick actually when you think of it. And the one thing that actually made a big difference when I taught a year 3 class, and this was really solidified for me when I started exploring this with my daughter, was the use of a dynamic model, a manipulative, in order to explore all of those things that I outlined above there. And it allows you to intercept that misconception of the circular number line, which comes back, of course, in all kinds of different things, whether it's the speedometer or the scale on a like a traditional kitchen scales. The circular number line comes up in quite a few different areas of our lives, and as adults it's easy to overlook the fact that we just get it. We get the circular number line. So I'm just going to have a look at one example for this, which is 10 to 2. And now there's a couple of things that could throw us off there. There's the triple alliteration that's going on. There's the fact that 2 one of those two is they're homophones, aren't they? And one is a preposition, whereas the other is actually a number. And what does that all mean? What does it all mean? So I'm going to switch back to my visualizer for a second and talk through just a few things actually that I was doing with my daughter and have done previously with my Year 3 class. Gemma, is that visible?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so we can see that I've set up 10 to 2 there, and you can see helpfully on this learning clock, freely available from all good school resources, shops, that we can see the 10 that it's hiding underneath the blue hand there, and of course the 2. And as adults, we've got to a place where of course we can just recall what that means. But children, it takes a lot of work for us to get them there. From a secondary perspective as well, I think there are some dynamics which I'll go into in a moment. First of all, this dynamic aspect that I was talking about, being able to physically move this allows us to talk about time as a duration, as something that moves. And when we're talking about 10 to 2, we're talking about that it's 10 minutes until 2. And really explain that in as many different ways as possible by showing that duration, that passing of time, allows that to become clearer for a young mind, that it's 10 minutes until we get to 2 o'clock. Well, when we say until 2 o'clock, of course, we mean that it's if we count in steps of 1 minute and we get 10 of those, that will take us from 50 minutes to 10 minutes. And of course, in this double number track, we can see that on the outer scale, we have those blue numbers and we have 50. And why do we have 50? Well, we've got 10 lots of 5, because each of these hours count as a 5-minute increment when we're counting in minutes, and 10 5s are 50. We can see how much is going on there, how easy it is to lose children or anyone who doesn't really grasp time for that matter. The other aspect then I think it allowed us to do, and so what I did with my daughter, is then to relate this to a number line and say, well, okay, so those red numbers there on a clock relate to the 12 hours we have in half a day, the 12 hours that we have in half a day. But let's not forget that if we talk about a full day, of course, there are 24 hours. And when we're talking about this blue hand moving, well, there are 60 minutes in every hour. And because there are 60 minutes in every hour, that is the important thing to hold on to. And that's why we're counting in increments of 5. So when we go back to that 10 to 2, we can then start asking things like children, things like, well, what does the 10 mean? The 10 means that there are 10 minutes until we get to the o'clock mark, of course. What does the 2 mean? Well, that refers to the duration until we reach o'clock. What does the 2 mean? Well, that's where our smaller red hand is pointing at the hour that we're talking about. I think the implications when I was then, I'm thinking about the secondary school possibilities, is as you get to the upper end of Key Stage 2, what often happens is that students revert back to formal algorithms to work out time. If we think about timetables, things like that, time durations, they'll use formal algorithms. And of course, a timeline, a number line, is incredibly important to use as a visual representation of passing time. And if you use a number line, a procedure that's based on our formal algorithms, then we're going to fall down, because that's all about the decimal system, the base 10 system, and time doesn't fit into our base 10 system. So I think it's really worth going back to those dynamic manipulatives, showing about the duration of time, talking about why we have, of course, the fractional aspects, as well as why those prepositions of past and to work, because time moves in one direction to the best of our knowledge, and how we can export, if you like, that double track circular number line into our traditional horizontal number line. Just going to switch back to my slides now. Thanks for being patient.
Has anyone got any questions at the moment at all? If you do pop them in the box and I'll let Joe know.
Thanks, Gemma. It might be a good time actually in that. Oh, someone else has taken control. Might be a good time if there are any questions, because I'm going to move on from maths now to think about a couple of other things. I can't see any questions for the meantime, Gemma, can you?
No. I'll let you know if any come through.
Okay, handwriting wise then. So handwriting is really important. I think when I first went into teaching, I wasn't always a teacher, and when I first came into teaching, I couldn't believe the amount of time that was spent on handwriting. And it's, having spoken to a few different people, one occupational therapist, one chap in particular, reminded me of why it's important, particularly for young children, to be practicing handwriting in terms of linking up the left and right side of the brains. So there are real cognitive benefits, as well as postural benefits and fine motor skills that they get from it. So beyond that, using a visualizer of handwriting, well, we can clearly model how letter formation should look and how it should take place. Handwriting speed can be demonstrated well, and common errors are easy to highlight. So I've just got three examples that I'd like to share of joining cursive letters. So in order to do this, I'm going to switch back to the visualizer.
We've had someone ask whether or not you record what you do on the visualizer. Yeah,
well, that's something actually that that chap Tim Dolan talks about. Personally, I don't, but I can see the value of why you might do that, because you can then, for example, kind of Hegarty math style, set that as part of your homework input, if you like. So personally, I don't, but I can definitely see a value of doing that. Good question.
Brilliant, thank you, Jay.
So I'm going to try and do this a little bit awkward, because obviously Visualiser being in the way, but I'll do my best to just model 3 letter strings. Now, may I apologize in advance? My handwriting is well known for being awful, so this is a good application of growth mindset. So the letters that I'm going to show are the join from a cursive A into a cursive D, the join from a cursive O into a cursive D, and importantly, this is the error that I'd like to pick up on, is the join from a cursive U into a cursive D. And what I'd often see from a cursive U is that join happens at the top there, making the U look like an I with an extra bit on, if that kind of makes sense. Now, as you're doing that, of course, I know a lot of people tend to use their Promethean or Smartboard software in order to demonstrate handwriting, which is a good way of doing it too. Is essentially the same job as a visualizer does. But I've had many problems in the past in terms of calibration, and that can be really frustrating when you're trying to show accurately how letters sit on the lines. If you've got any problems with calibrations in terms of your projector and your smartboard, then that can be a real issue. Easily solved by showing that on a live pad like this. I tend to either actually use the whiteboard pen there, or perhaps a Sharpie, so it's really nice and clear and stands out well on the visualizer. So the particular example here is that I chose an A joining to a D to show how an A comes back down onto that lower blue line in order to then go into the D. How for an O, actually it doesn't come back down to the line, but for U, it must come back down to the line in order to maintain its integrity as a U. Okay, I'm going to switch back to my slides very briefly. I think the switching between applications is one of the challenges, of course, of maintaining pace within in a live lesson. Live marking, another important aspect that visualizers can be used for, both in a bricks and mortar classroom and in a remote environment, and therefore equally important for a blended environment if you've got perhaps some children self-isolating in the forthcoming weeks or months ahead. So live marking, incredibly powerful. Like I mentioned before, a vital component of a lot of Asian pedagogy sounds, not just Shanghai, but in South Korea from Gemma's experience. Brilliant for intercepting both transcription errors and misconceptions, and I'll show that with the example that I'm going to use in a moment. And it can be used to scaffold what success should look like too. So to have a think about that. You might have a focus on spelling and grammar. You might think about vocabulary, and you might have that opportunity to intercept a misconception. I'm going to have a look at a couple of those things now in terms of a piece of writing from science that our year 5s were doing recently. So hopefully my visualizer is back up on the screen now. This was done towards the end of January, and they were comparing the development during childhood between the needs of children at reception and towards the end of upper key stage 2. Now, so if we look at that first paragraph here, their strength and stamina isn't very good since they're still little. They start to run around at preschool, but they aren't very fast yet. Okay, so far so good. Their muscles start to grow, although the rate of growth depends on what they eat. Seems well-structured paragraph. Can't seem to spot any obvious misconceptions or errors there. But perhaps as I was walking around, having a look at that second paragraph there, they normally very active. Oh, I can see that there seems to be a word. Okay, well there's just a transcription error. I can show that by saying they are normally very active and fit. Here's a clear capital letter missing. Their muscles have grown a lot. Oh, this is an error that I tended to make a lot when I was younger. For years I thought that a lot was one word, but of course that is 2 separate words there. A lot since they were toddlers, so they are. There we go. There's another example. They are a lot stronger. Thankfully, when I look back at the top of this paragraph, and again that thankfully I can see there's a misconception, a spag misconception around the use of the suffix, and where this child has used a single L in the suffix. Of course, we should be using double ly. A double ly is what we should be using. They're able to control their strength, which is something that toddlers struggle with. Now, of course, in terms of up-leveling this work or improving and showing what success looks like, really this paragraph should be linked back to the final conclusion of this paragraph here, which was about the rate of growth depending on what they eat. And this surely is actually a similarity between children at reception and children at 9 and 10 years old. That's something that then I'll probably model under the visualizer for everyone to say, well, really we'd want to tie those 2 paragraphs together, either through a comparison or a distinction, a difference that we can identify, and I'll probably talk about that rate of growth being dependent on what they eat. So I'm just going to switch back to the slide very quickly before I go on to the final example. This was one very much that I thought about in terms of remote learning, but actually it has implications for bricks and mortar classrooms too. Reading engagement. Now, remote learners, or for that matter, children in class, are unlikely to have their own copy of the text. Sometimes you can manage a copy of a core class text for everyone. But if you're doing something like, a class text, or maybe story time in a primary setting, certainly we do what's called drop everything and read at the end of the day. And because that changes quite regularly, we don't have a copy for every child. We don't have a copy for 1 between 2. If you're in that situation, visualizers can be a fantastic resource to share the text with everyone. Also, if you're thinking about, storybooks or picture books earlier down the age range, it's a brilliant way of sharing illustrations. and important in terms of encouraging sight reading. So you've got the oral enjoyment that not all children have. Not all children are lucky enough to have stories read to them at home, or text in general read to them. So they can enjoy that the oral experience, as well as being encouraged to sight read various aspects of the text and begin to recognize words on sight rather than having to sound them out. The example that I'm going to use just very, very quickly is one of my favorite books. I love reading this to my daughter at bedtime, and even my youngest daughter, who's not yet one, she gets involved in it as well. It's called The Lion Inside, and it's just got fantastic illustrations. I think I'm just going to show you the final page from it, and it's called The Lion Inside by Jim Bright. They've done a few books actually where this chap Jim Bright, where the illustrations are fantastic, and I think it's just a brilliant way of getting children excited about reading. So I can probably rather than switching to my visualizer, I could show on this camera now, but I am going to switch to my visualizer just to show you that final illustration from the page, which underpins the message for the moral, if you like, for the whole story. So the lion, the mouse goes on an adventure and finds out that the lion is also scared of mice, and they end up sitting together looking at the sunsets. And the final message is, yes, that day they both learned that no matter your size, we all have a mouse and a lion inside. And I think it's just a really lovely message and a really lovely image to finish that story with, and something that's really quite inspiring. You know, when we talk about the power of reading to unlock so much knowledge and cultural capital for children, I think it's important to inspire reading in a general sense, and certainly in the primary sector, that's very important. When we think of a secondary sector, I think some of the things that Tim Dolan points out in terms of setting up so you can follow specific points in text are really that's how a visualizer can be used really well. So we're just about reaching the end of my presentation. I'm going to go and talk about the top tips very quickly, and then we'll open up to the floor to see if there's any questions. So let's navigate back to the top tips. Thanks for being patient. So my top tips would be here. I've got 5 of them. One is to plan discrete points in the lesson. One of the things that I've been thinking about with the remote lessons that I've delivered is how important it is to pre-plan as much as possible concise explanations, and equally discrete points at which you use resources, manipulatives, or the visualizer in order, in this case, in order to show and exemplify certain aspects. So I think that's as true. We have more room in a bricks and mortar classroom to use it more organically and be more ad hoc about it, but I think planning discrete points is definitely one of my top tips. Secondly, link it to pause points. So Doug Lemov's idea of pause points is where, as teachers, our comfort zone is talking. That's what we're good at. That's what we revert to at points where we're a little bit unsure. But actually, he suggests that within 3 minutes, try to get children active, and then 5 minutes or so thereafter, keep them active, keep them cognitively engaged, keep them accountable for what's going on, allow formative thinking to take place. And for that reason, visualizers can be used at a couple of points, maybe 2 to 3 times per lesson, but I wouldn't overuse it, and that would be my third top tip, as you can see. The fourth top tip would be something that I talked about briefly in that first maths example, which is about modeling deliberate mistakes to really generate that active participation, and children love that, don't they? All students love that, spotting where you've made mistakes, and also to make sure that you haven't got passengers in the lesson, that that children are switched on. And the fifth point, and it particularly important, I think, for when I think back about my presentation for today, is having resources ready. It's really important that whatever you want to show is well organized and well prepped, and that logistically you're ready to go. That brings me to the end of today's session today, Gemma. I don't know if we have any questions that have come through in the chat so far.
Yeah, we've just had one from Becky saying, in terms of the visualizer you are using, is it a rigid visualizer or does it have a flexible stand? And are there any that you've used that you would recommend to use in schools? Perhaps can we see your visualizer, please?
Yes, yeah, I'll pick this up now. I blue tacked it in place for the meantime, so it wouldn't be moving about too much during this presentation. But so this one looks like this.
Yeah.
So it's got a flexible head. It's called a hue or a Huey, HUE, and there's a Hue and there's a Hue Pro model. I think if I was going to recommend one, I think there's only about a £10, £15 price difference. Go for the Hue Pro. This one is okay, but it's a little bit frustrating. I don't know if you noticed with the framing there, it's not quite tall enough the neck, and so therefore I can't always fit everything in. That, you know, when I showed the book at the end there, I couldn't quite show everything in. So you want a little bit of a longer neck than the one that this one has. Secondly, so if you were doing remote learning, what I've done today is I've switched between the Teams app and then I've shared the Visualize app, which runs through an app called VLC, which you might know for playing various media. It plays MP4 and all kinds of things like that. Now, the Hue Visualizer utilizes VLC as its app essentially. But what that means is you can, as I found out from harsh experience, within Teams, you can choose to switch your camera. So if I go up now to my camera icon, hover over it, I can choose to switch between or go to device settings, the webcam that I've got on top of my monitor here, or I can use the visualizer camera. And I did that for some of my lessons until I realized that was producing well, it would crash the computer. So essentially the use of this camera would freeze, and then that would have a knock-on effect on Teams, and that's a bit of a nightmare obviously in the middle of a lesson. Not an issue in a bricks and mortar lesson, but if you're doing a blended lesson or remote learning, then that would be an issue. So my two advice would be whichever visualizer, two pieces of advice, whichever visualizer you are using, make sure it's got long enough neck, because that can be a little bit awkward if you're trying to fit stuff in the frame. And go for, if you do go for a Hue one, which are a good price point option, go for the Hue Pro rather than the standard Hue one. I've got a third piece of advice actually, which is Adam Boxer, who many of you might know, has written a specific blog on the use of visualizers. Well worth checking out actually. He's got some good advice there. And one of the pieces of advice that he says is to use this particular whiteboard pen, which is the Edding 361. And I'd agree, it's really good. It's thick enough whilst fine enough to do some detail.
Brilliant, thanks, Jay. Anyone else got any questions at all? Or perhaps an examples they've used of, they can share of using the visualizer? Nothing coming through at the moment, Joe. I think you covered everything for us. So I must say, Joe, thank you very much for obviously giving up your time to support us with the programme tonight and with the webinars. Like we said, we are offering a range of webinars. We've got our last one of this series next Thursday, which is around secondary schools using technology to enhance for Rosenstein principles, for reviews, recaps and checking understanding. And I'm also running a series of trainee webinars at the moment. So if you have got any NQTs or trainee teachers that you think would benefit, do get in touch with our EdTech demonstrator programme. We'll be able to help you.
Brilliant, thanks, Gemma. So I don't think I've got anything else to add other than saying thanks for coming along today. I hope it was useful, and happy use of Visualizer. Hope it proves a valuable device both when we get back to full classrooms on the 8th, and if you have to deal with any blended situations or isolating bubbles. Thanks very much, everyone.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. We'll just let everyone leave.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, everyone. Have you finished recording, Dan?
I'll just do that.